a warm summer evening in January 1980, 57-year-old Andrzej Andy Komarniczki walked out of his home in the rural town of St. George, Queensland, and vanished without a trace. Andy, a Polish-born businessman known locally as the Kangaroo King for his thriving kangaroo meat enterprise, had headed out around 7:30 p.m. to check on the refrigeration at his processing plant on the town's outskirts. It was a routine errand he did every night. But this time, Andy never came back. Hours later, his vehicle was found abandoned near a weir on the Balonne River, about 300 meters from his kangaroo works. The truck was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, and there was no sign of Andy. Family and friends scoured the dark scrub and riverbanks in a panic, then alerted police. Despite an intensive all-night search and a wider air and ground hunt the next day, not a single trace of Andy Komarniczki turned up. It was as if the outback had swallowed him whole. Investigators arriving on scene noted subtle but eerie clues. The next morning, Andy's stepson spotted a line of scuffed footprints leading from the plant's gate out to the nearby road. The prints matched the flat soles of Andy's shoes, suggesting he had indeed made it to his workplace and then walked out toward the road, perhaps to flag someone down. To the family, it looked like Andy met someone there. "There were lots of footprints on the main road. I reckon that's where they grabbed him," his stepson Frank later recalled. Whatever occurred, it happened fast. No signs of struggle were obvious by the truck. Andy, it seemed, had been led away or abducted in an instant. The question was, by whom and why? Kangaroo shooting was big business in St. George in the 1980s, and Andy Komarniczki ran one of the region's busiest kangaroo processing plants. His success in the industry earned him the nickname the Kangaroo King. To understand the possibilities, one must know who Andy Komarniczki was. He wasn't just a random farmer. He was a self-made success story in Queensland's Wild West. Born in 1922, Andy survived the turmoil of World War II in Europe and emigrated to Australia, seeking a fresh start. By the 1970s, he had become a prominent dealer in kangaroo skins and meat, co-owning the St. George Kangaroo Processing Works and several other local businesses. Ranchers and roo hunters from all over the state, and even across the New South Wales border, knew Andy as a top buyer. Every weekend, dozens of professional kangaroo shooters drove into St. George with truckloads of carcasses because Andy paid cash, and he paid better than anyone else. He had a reputation for carrying thick wads of bills to pay his suppliers on the spot. In fact, the weekend he disappeared, Andy had just withdrawn roughly $35,000 from the bank on Friday to bankroll purchases. By Saturday night, he was likely carrying as much as $110,000 in cash and checks from the roo trade, a huge sum, especially in 1980. This fact did not escape notice. Early headlines dubbed him the Kangaroo King and speculated that Andy was murdered and robbed of that small fortune by persons unknown. Yet money alone may not explain the fear that had been shadowing Andy in his final days. According to family members, Andy had been uneasy for some time before he vanished, almost as if he was a marked man. His stepson recalls Andy voicing concern that someone was going to knock him off in the lead-up to the incident. Andy wasn't the type to scare easily. He was a tough, savvy outback businessman who always carried a firearm for protection. In fact, he had a licensed 7-shot Browning pistol that seldom left his side, precisely because he'd told people he feared for his life over some business dealings. Just a few months earlier, in late 1979, Andy had even phoned an investigative journalist in Sydney, telling him he was in real trouble and afraid for his safety. He wouldn't say why over the phone, but the implication was that something big and dangerous was going on behind the scenes. All these warnings would tragically come to seem prophetic. Despite Andy's precautions, whatever fate befell him on January 12, 1980, happened without witnesses and without much of a struggle. No one in town reported hearing gunshots or cries that night. Investigators found Andy's truck intact, not stuck or crashed, suggesting he parked it at the weir by his plant as usual and stepped out voluntarily or to meet someone he trusted. There were no obvious signs of blood or injury at the scene. Law enforcement quickly realized they were dealing with a likely abduction or foul play scenario. The challenge was enormous. The surrounding area was remote and sparsely populated, full of empty scrubland, old farm wells, and a winding river, countless places a body could be hidden or destroyed. Police divers plunged into the Balonne River to search the murky bottom. Officers and locals scouted every track and watering hole for days, hoping for any clue. Nothing definitive turned up. For the tight-knit community of St. George, a chill set in. Was there a killer among them? Everybody was walking around, wondering if they were going to be next, one resident remembered, of the tense weeks after Andy vanished. With public pressure mounting, authorities convened a coronial inquest later in 1980 to probe Andy Komarniczki's disappearance. Dozens of witnesses were called to testify. Kangaroo shooters, business associates, townsfolk, and many theories were aired. The picture that emerged was as dramatic as it was murky. Andy, by all accounts, had enemies as well as admirers. The local police sergeant noted Andy was in good health, under no financial strain, and not the type of person who would shoot through or take his own life, reinforcing that foul play was the likely explanation. The coroner ultimately concluded that Andy had most likely been murdered that night and his body disposed of in an unknown location. However, there was not enough evidence to officially name any suspect. One tantalizing clue came out during the inquest. 2 witnesses reported seeing an unidentified man lurking near Andy's meatworks 2 days before the disappearance. This man was dressed in bib overalls and was spotted crouching as if holding a rifle. When approached, he ran off into the bush. At the time, nobody knew who he was, and he has never been positively identified. Investigators pondered if this mystery man could have been stalking Andy or setting up an ambush. It was a strong lead, but like so many in the case, it led nowhere concrete. Over the years, Andy Komarniczki's fate has been the subject of intense speculation. One major theory is that Andy stumbled onto or became entangled in an organized criminal syndicate operating in the meat industry. In the early 1980s, Australia was rocked by revelations of a meat substitution racket, a scheme in which pet-grade horse and kangaroo meat was illegally processed and sold as beef for human consumption. Andy's own family members have since acknowledged that not all of the kangaroo meat from his plant stayed in the dog food aisle. Andy himself would watch TV meat pie commercials and quip, "That's my meat," only half joking. In 1981, just a year after Andy vanished, a U.S. inspector's discovery of horse meat in Australian beef exports blew the scandal wide open, triggering a royal commission and confirming that a clandestine trade in wild game meat was indeed flourishing. By then, Andy had been missing for over a year, and he wasn't named in the commission's report. But many in the industry privately wondered if there was a connection. Some believed Andy might have uncovered or gotten involved in the scheme shortly before he disappeared, and that shadowy figures silenced him to protect their racket. Supporting this idea, an insider later revealed that Andy had been on the verge of securing a valuable new export market for kangaroo skins just before he went missing, a development that allegedly ruffled competitors' feathers. There is no doubt he was bumped off because he was proving too successful and treading on too many toes, that source said, adding that with Andy gone, a huge slice of Queensland's kangaroo trade was up for grabs. A second theory points to a more straightforward motive: robbery. Andy's habit of carrying large amounts of cash was well known. If opportunistic thieves learned that he routinely traveled alone at night with tens of thousands of dollars, they might have targeted him purely for financial gain. This theory doesn't require organized crime kingpins or elaborate conspiracies, only the cruel opportunism of criminals who knew a wealthy man's nightly routine. Perhaps someone followed him to the plant, confronted him at the weir, and disposed of his body after taking the money. It's a plausible narrative, especially given the initial evidence of robbery. However, questions remain. If common crooks were responsible, how did they so completely hide Andy's remains and any evidence of the crime? The robbery theory therefore overlaps with the syndicate theory. In both cases, the perpetrators could have been familiar to Andy and adept at covering their tracks. Finally, there are the outlier theories, misadventure or voluntary disappearance, which most investigators and family members regard as long shots. Could Andy have simply had an accident or wandered off? Those who knew him doubt it. He had no reason to run away from his successful life, and he was looking forward to a family trip to Europe later that year. Suicide also rang false. He left no note and had made plans for the future. As for a fatal mishap, say Andy tripped into the river or down an old well, police found zero evidence of that despite exhaustive searches. Divers dragged the river and found nothing. The coroner's findings in 1981 explicitly favored abduction or homicide over any accident scenario. Nonetheless, in the absence of a body, some bizarre rumors sprouted legs. In St. George, gossip spread that perhaps Andy wasn't dead at all, that he had faked his disappearance and flown off in a small plane waiting outside town. Others whispered that Andy's body met a gruesome end, disposed of in the very meat grinder at his plant. A lot of people thought, "Someone's done the wrong thing and put him through the mincer," recalled a local teacher decades later. These macabre theories gained enough traction that police actually checked the processing equipment for human remains, but forensic tests came up empty. There was also the issue of Andy's personal pistol. If someone attacked him, why did he apparently never fire a shot? One local pointed out that nobody would sneak up on Andy because he always had a gun. Everybody knew it, which fueled fanciful tales that Andy might have outsmarted his would-be killers and gone into hiding himself. To this day, however, there is no credible evidence that Andy staged his own vanishing act. In the aftermath, the disappearance of the Kangaroo King became one of Queensland's most notorious unsolved mysteries, at least in the local consciousness. It made headlines around Australia at the time, and in St. George, people never stopped speculating about what really happened. But as the years rolled on with no answers, Andy Komarniczki's story drifted into obscurity elsewhere. No arrests were ever made. Andy's family were left in limbo, with only fragments of rumor and the pain of not knowing. How does somebody walk out a door and not come back? Andy's stepdaughter Judy wondered. The case has periodically been revisited, with fresh appeals for anyone with information to come forward. The Queensland police have never officially closed Andy's file. A hefty reward of $250,000 remains on offer for information leading to a conviction in his suspected murder. And each year during National Missing Persons Week, authorities highlight Andy's case among those long-term missing persons they are determined to resolve. His disappearance happened in a small rural town decades before the internet, and 24/7 media made every mystery a viral sensation. Outside of Queensland, it faded from the news after the initial flurry, buried in archives and the memories of those who lived it. Much of the detailed information survives only in old newspaper clippings and niche reports, not easily accessible to the public. For now, Andy's story remains a cold case known mostly to St. George locals and Australian missing persons registries. 45 years on, the Kangaroo King's fate is still unsolved, a haunting whodunit on the dusty plains of Queensland, waiting for the day when someone somewhere finally breaks their silence.